When I think about that contemplation that we will all die one day, I just want to tell you all a story. Last year during ABODE Academy, we talked about death in different ways. In my night, we talked about how how the dying process goes. And if you're a death doula, you've heard my talk on that. So I kind of gave a kind of an abbreviated talk on the dying process. And that night, my sister Betty had never been on Zoom, and she followed ABODE, and she was one of our diamond fans. And on Facebook, if you like something enough, you get to be a diamond fan. And anyway, she said to me, I want to hear that. I want to hear what you have to say." So for about a week, we worked and got her a Zoom account and showed her how to use it. And she heard my lecture on the dying process. So that was on Thursday. So on Thursday, we did the talk, and she called me that night after I talked, and she thanked me and said that was really meaningful for her. And she said, I don't fear death anymore. And I learned so much. She died the week later. And, it was totally unexpected. But I think her soul knew that she was dying. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. And it kind of brings back memories to me tonight, because this was the time of year that it was. And she died about 1 year ago. But we're going to start our series tonight. And we've got a treat for you. So if you have not met Jerry, Jerry is one of our new doulas. He just finished the course. And the more we got to know Jerry, the more Natalie and I looked at each other and went, okay, we got to get this guy on board. So he is now our resident doula, and you'll find him in the house most afternoons if you drop by. He's just helping out and doing the doula work that needs to be done. He is a San Antonio native whose life and work are deeply rooted in community, education, spirituality, and care. He completed his undergraduate studies at Millbury, Vermont, and earned a master's in sociology from the University of Texas at San Antonio, and just completed, yay, Jerry, his PhD in culture, literacy, and language at UTSA, where his research focuses on necropolitics, symbolic violence, and death studies. Before beginning doctoral study, Jerry taught in an SAISD for 8 years, where he taught Japanese and culture studies and was recognized repeatedly for his excellence in the classroom, including being named Teacher of the Year for 5 years, earning the distinction of Region 20 World Language Teacher of the Year. Jerry's approach to death is shaped by both scholarship and lived experience, including his own near-death experience, which transformed the way he understands transition, grief, embodiment, and the sacred. His worldview is also informed by spirituality and curandismo, a traditional healing practice rooted in indigenous Mexican and folk spiritual knowledge that attends to the emotional, spiritual, and physical dimensions of well-being. Through this lens, Jerry sees death not simply as an ending, but as a profound passage that calls for ritual, accompaniment, remembrance, and communal care. These values also guide his outreach work, including the creation of the SA Texas Queer Death Care Collective, a space for building death literacy, community support, and affirming conversations around dying, grief, and remembrance. Beyond his academic and community work, Jerry is someone who treasures spirituality, ancestral connection, teaching, and creative expression. He is especially drawn to saint veneration, curandismo, devotional art, and practices that honor memory, transition, and the unseen. He also finds joy in language study, cultural studies, ritual work, and creating spaces where others can feel held, witnessed, and empowered. He gave me this, and I kept thinking, oh, I'm going to pare it down. But there was so much there. And Jerry has started some wonderful practices in the home, like clearing out rooms once one of our patients has passed. We go in and we just change the energy of the room, and holding space with those that just need to be held, and providing cigarettes for those who need to go out on the patio and have a smoke. So he does it all, and we're so excited to have you here with us tonight, Jerry. And thank you for doing this for us.
Of course. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. It's always interesting hearing your own life told back to you.
Yeah, but I couldn't take anything out. It was all he did.
Well, thank you. No, I appreciate it. I think it's important, right, for people to know how you arrived at the work that you do, right? Because I think a lot of times, especially when it comes to death care and death work, we think, right, am I the right person to do this kind of work, right? Or, do I have a calling? Is this, the right thing for me? And I think a lot of times we realize, right, we are coming from different spaces, different avenues in life, but there is always something, right, that brings us back to this moment of trying to understand, right? How can we really humanize death practices? Especially because we start having these experiences where we realize how disconnected we are from death care in our modern world.
That's right.
Okay. So, let's see. Christy, did you want to share the presentation? Oh, okay, there we go. Yes, perfect. Okay, so let's get started. So today I want to invite us to think about death literacy as a form of care. I think, of course, like just trying to unpack, right? What do I mean by death literacy? Um, it's a big thing, right? Even when we think about just literacy in general, we tend to think about the ability to read and write. Um, and so I want us to think about, right, the way that we are able to involve ourselves in death practices, right? The knowledge that we know, the way that we connect ourselves back to community. So the title of my presentation today is Death Literacy, Embracing Dying, Deepening Care, and Honoring Life Through Ritual. Why learning how to face death helps us live, care, and remember differently. And so death literacy is not only about knowing what happens at the end of life, it is about learning how to speak about death, prepare for it, accompany one another through it, and honor it in ways that are humane, communal, and meaningful. And in many ways, death literacy helps us return death to the realm of relationship, community, and dignity, rather than leaving it only in the hands of crisis, silence, and fear. Okay, next slide, please. And so, what is death literacy? So, death literacy is more than just understanding what happens when someone dies. Right? I think, of course, we all have had different experiences of what death looks like to us, what we even think about death for ourselves, right? Whether we're comfortable with the idea, whether we fear it, whether we find it right as a sacred passage, right? And all of these types of knowledges, right? And I use that in the plural sense because our understanding of death is not just a singular, linear um, kind of connection, right? It is something that is deeply rooted in who we are as people. It is deeply rooted within our various kind of cultural representations. And so it's important for us to know, right, that there is not one single way to understand death or dying, right? So this includes knowledge and skills and awareness that help people navigate dying, caregiving, grief, loss, and end of life decision making, right? It involves practical knowledge, such as knowing what resources exist, but it also includes emotional, relational, and community knowledge. In this sense, death literacy is about building our capacity to meet death with greater confidence, compassion, and care. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting, there is actually something called the Death Literacy Institute. And these were some of their kind of major statistics, right, that they publish on their website. Only 1 in 5 people know how to navigate the health system when someone is dying or trying to access aged care, right? And I think a lot of times what we know is either what has been demonstrated to us, um, sadly, right, through media, right, in some form, right? We see the way death is treated on either television or within movies or something, and we think, oh, that's how it's going to be, right? Or this is what's going to happen. Or we learn through experience, and oftentimes that experience is now already layered with crisis, with situations where we don't feel like we really have a handle on what's going on, right? And so we are literally learning as we go in these situations. Only 1 in 3 people know how to navigate the funeral industry. Um, Even speaking for myself, my father passed away recently. Next month will be a year, so he passed away last May, and it was unexpected, right? We had no idea that he was going to pass. Nothing. And I was responsible. I chose to be the responsible one to make all of the funeral arrangements, and I had no idea how to even begin, right, navigating this system. Um, I just remember, right, looking through all of the documents, and of course, right, the funeral directors are doing what they do, which is showcasing what death could look like for your family member, right? And how you can kind of ritualize what's going on or memorialize what's going on with your loved one. And I just remember kind of having this very kind of out of body experience and thinking, how do people even do this? Right? It's so complicated. And I can also understand how people kind of get tied up in the emotion of what is happening. Um, and because the one thing that I do hear is after the fact of funerals and everything happening, people then kind of having time to really process what has happened and saying, you know what, I wish we would have done this differently. Or I wish we would have honored, what my loved one wanted. Um, and so you can see, right, that there are people are entering these spaces without ever having the opportunity to really discuss with each other, right? I remember turning to my siblings and saying, what did dad want? Right? Like what can we do? And of course you're trying to figure this out by just thinking, oh my God, did he ever talk about what he wanted, if he died, right? And of course, like the one thing that, we did remember were like jokes that he made about, oh, if I die, just, toss me into the ocean, right, and be done with it. So you're like, okay, yeah, that's obviously not an option. So what else do we have? But yes, you're trying to think and kind of like put this together, right? Almost like puzzle piece. Um, how to keep somebody's memory alive in these moments. And it's riddled with uncertainty, with lacking kind of this connection because the reality is not once did we ever sit down with my father and just ask him, right, genuinely, Dad, how do you want us to remember you, right? How do you want us to have your funeral? Um, and so, right, that's also part of what, is death literacy. It also says that only half of us know where to get information about palliative care, right? I mean, I know so many people who have, of course, heard the term hospice, but when I begin speaking to them about palliative care, they have no idea that that's even an option or that this even exists. Um, because of course, right, even the word hospice, right, the word hospice gives people such a fright of like basically almost like if you're sending your loved one off to just, I guess get killed. But so there's so much kind of miscommunication, and lack of literacy, right, in these situations, right? Because the reality is we've been so far removed from what death actually is that we have begun to kind of fill in the gaps with what we believe is really happening or what we believe these institutions can provide us. And a lot of it is not in truth, right? A lot of it is just what we think or what we've heard. And the last statistic that the Death Literacy Institute provided was only 22% of people know how to access palliative care in our local communities, right? So same thing. We don't know where to go, where to even begin, right? And part of it is because we don't even we don't even want to begin with these conversations in our own homes, right? Having the conversation with our loved ones about, right, what do you think about death, right? How do you want to be remembered is creates such a fear in us, right? Or maybe not even a fear, but maybe we just don't even know how to get started. And so because of that, right, we don't even know where these resources exist outside of our homes, right? Within our local communities, how to access them, are they free? Do they cost something? Do they, how do we even get started? And so part of that is understanding, right? What can death literacy really provide us? Okay, next slide, please. And so, why does death literacy matter, right? So, death literacy matters because death touches every family and every community, yet many people still feel unprepared when it arrives. People often do not know how to start conversations about dying, how to support someone at the end of life, or how to respond when grief enters their lives. Death literacy helps reduce fear and confusion by giving us language, understanding, and practical ways to care. It reminds us that dying is not only a medical event, but also a human, emotional, spiritual, and communal experience. The other thing that I want to mention, so when I wrote this line, right, that death is not dying and death is not only a medical event, right? I think what is so interesting about that phrase is that for the vast majority of human history, death and dying was never a medical event, right? Um, we were just literally having this conversation at a different meeting, right? Because, right, institutions, especially medical institutions, have kind of stepped into that role, right? Of how do we provide death care, right, to communities, especially when people no longer have, right, these kind of cultural connections or this knowledge of what death should look like. We have relied on medicine, right, to provide those gaps for us. And I think because of that, we only see death through this kind of medical lens, right? We also see death almost as if it's not inevitable, right? And so we look to medicine to fix it, right? Make it go away, right? As if we can somehow outrace it. But the reality is, right, is death is there. It's going to happen. It's going to happen to every single one of us. And as Beverly mentioned, right, when I think about my own experience of almost dying from pneumonia and sepsis, I never in my life would have thought at the age of 33 that I would be in a medical coma, um, on a ventilator, on life support, on ECMO, surviving, right? And trying and literally before, right, the doctor telling me that they would have to put me on a ventilator, having to literally make all of these incredible life decisions in that moment, right? Thinking about, oh my God, okay, well, how will they access my bank account? Who's going to pay my rent because I take care of my mother, right? And who's going to take care of my mother if I die, right? Having to ponder all of this. And the reality is because why? Because I never just had this conversation. Um, and so because, like I said, we rely so much on medicine, just fix it, right? Make it go away. When we are put in those situations and we realize that, you know what? Medicine may not always have that answer, right? And the reality is that any one little thing could have gone wrong in that situation, and I would not be here today. And I think that's the important thing too, right? Is to realize that death literacy exists outside of medicine. It has always existed outside of medicine. Um, and I think part of the sad reality is that capitalism, right, plays on our fear of death. And where there is fear, there is money to be made off of that fear, right? And instead of us kind of embracing and honoring death for what it is, just a part of life, um, right? Institutions know that they can cater to our fear of that reality. And so part of it is, right, kind of reconnecting ourselves to what is death, right? Outside of just this kind of medical experience. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So I really wanted to put this slide in, and I thought about it for a minute, right? Because I thought, okay, I doubt there will be any like children in the Zoom room. But as somebody who was a teacher, I was always fascinated with how do we bring these very complex like ideas to children, right? And I think one of the things that's so interesting is that when I do look at books that talk about death, for children. I think, you know what? I know many adults where these books will also help them, right? Really embrace this idea, this sacredness of what death is. Um, and so children also, right? They also experience grief and loss and questions about death. And even when adults try to shield them from it, I know so many people who have questioned, oh, I have a funeral to go to, but I don't want to take my children, right? Because I don't want them to have to experience that, right? And I think they're going to experience it, right? The more that you shield them from this reality, right? The older that they become and the harder it is for them to then understand, right? What is this? What is happening? And sometimes we don't, right? As a teacher, I remember you don't always have the answer for something, but it's important to just be with somebody in that moment, right? To get them to think about, what it is that is bothering them, what it is that they have a question about. And of course, we know, right? For kids, trying to wrap their mind around what is death, even for us as adults, right? We sit there and go back and forth. Is death the spiritual thing? Am I just, now going to be food for bacteria, right? Like we go back and forth about what is death, and children do the same thing, right? So it's all about just providing them the space to think about these very complex ideas with us. And so I put these two books in there because I think they're both incredible books, both in the way that they illustrate death and the way that they humanize death. So both also create a very kind of personification of what death is, right? So one of them is called Duck Death and the Tulip, and the other one is called Cry Heart But Never Break. And in both of them, at least for the Cry Heart But Never Break, the grandchildren are talking with death and trying to understand, right, why death has arrived at their home. And of course, having this conversation with death, right? So in this case, death is actually playing the role of the facilitator, right, in teaching children about this process and what does it mean. And in the other one, literally the duck and death are like friends and they're experiencing kind of life together. But like I said, it's a very interesting way it's a very interesting thing in the way that we we talk about death, right? And the way that these books are designed for children, um, because sometimes I think maybe death literacy is actually very simplistic, but we've made it so controversial, so taboo, so unimaginable, right? That we are constantly trying to avoid it when in reality it is simple. I will tell you this though, just because we're talking about children's books. I remember reading a book when I was living in Japan, and it was a book about death, and it was for children. And that book will always stand out to me because I thought I knew where the book was going, and I hadn't. It completely like ruined me at the end. Um, and so, similar to kind of the Duck, Death, and Tulip book, right? I kind of figured that the duck was going to die. And then, as you can see in that little image, Death is carrying the duck. And I also was like, oh my God, so heartbroken for the duck. Um, but this book that I read in Japan is this little kid and their puppy. And of course, like as the book is going along, they are having fun and playing outside and doing all these things with each other. And so I knew the book was about death. And so of course I'm already, preparing myself mentally and emotionally because I'm like, oh, I'm gonna turn the page and the dog is gonna die and the little kid is gonna, have to deal with it. And so I turned the page and the little kid actually dies. And the rest of the book is about the dog trying to learn to live without their human companion. And I thought it was a very interesting way to talk about death from a completely different experience that we normally don't even think about, right? But it does show us about how we form relationships and connections, and what happens, right, when we don't have a way to talk about this experience, right? When we don't have a way to make sense of what is happening. So obviously I completely right suggest if you are interested in reading books about death, right? And you're like, oh, there's no way I'm going to get through this massive chapter book about dying and stuff. Look for kids' books on death. They are some of the most beautiful representations of death literacy that I've ever encountered. Okay, next slide. And so death literacy as community work, right? So death literacy is not only something an individual learns on their own, it is something communities build together. Families, friends, neighbors, faith communities, doulas, caregivers, and care spaces all play a role in helping people navigate dying, death, and grief. When communities become more death literate, care no longer falls only on hospitals or certain caregivers in the family, or moments of crisis, right? Instead, death becomes something that can be held with greater honesty, shared responsibility, and compassion. In this way, death literacy becomes a form of community care. And then in this slide, you can see here, I purposely chose these images because these are all communal representations of death care around the world, right? And you all will have the ability to experience several of these different kind of communal cultural representations of death care in the upcoming weeks. But we can see, right, that they have always involved community, right? And I think a lot of Western society has kind of stripped that from us, right? So somebody starts getting sick and we put them somewhere else, right? And then somebody dies, same thing, we put them in the hands of someone else, right? And we put them into funerals. The funeral takes care of them. They dress them, they cleanse them, they do all of these things. And then ultimately they bury them, right? But there is so much that is removed from us as community, right? Many people don't even know that you can have funerals in your home, right? Or that you don't have to call a funeral home right away, right? It's not an emergency after when somebody passes. Um, it's important, right? I know one of the guests that we recently had, their spouse, right, had been their caregiver for such a long time. And I remember, telling them that while you're here, I want you to just be their spouse, right? I want you to be here with us, right? Allow us as a community of people at Abode to all take care of your spouse, right? Your loved one. And let us also help in that work, right? Because it's important for you to also take the time to just be with them, right? Be a human in that moment and cry with them, hold them, right? Do the things that have you've put on the side because in your mind you're like, oh, I got to care for them, I got to feed them, I got to change them, I got to do these things. But in reality, right, when we are supported by a community, we allow people to take on different roles so that others who really need that time and space to do the grieving, to do the care work, are provided with that opportunity to do it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the cultural avoidance of death, right? Obviously, I'm sure everybody in this Zoom room knows exactly what that looks like, right? One of the central challenges we face is that death is still widely avoided in everyday culture. Many people understand that end-of-life conversations are important, but still do not know how to begin them or feel afraid to do so. As a result, death often remains hidden until a crisis forces us into the open. This avoidance can leave families unprepared, create unnecessary fear, and make loss feel even more isolating. When we avoid death, we often lose opportunities for meaningful conversation, planning, and connection. Um, and this actually had a lot to do with my dissertation work, right? When we have become so avoidant of death and having these conversations, then when death happens around us, right, especially tragic events, we become so disconnected from these events, right? And almost ignore the occurrence of them because it's just like, oh, okay, well, yes, it's just more death, it's just more this. Um, but I feel like the reason why we don't have that attachment anymore is because we've become so separated from what death actually looks like. And so then when it does get closer to us and it is our loved one or it is us, right? Suddenly we also feel unprepared and we don't know how to even begin handling it. And so we spend so much of our last moments, our final time just constantly searching for answers, or asking questions that don't ever, right, get answered. Okay, next question. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so the current state of death literacy is beginning to grow as an area of public conversation, research, and community practice. There is increasing recognition that people need more support in understanding dying, caregiving, grief, and remembrance. At the same time, there are still major gaps in public knowledge and confidence. Many people do not know what end of life resources are available, how to prepare, or how to talk openly about death with loved ones. So while awareness is growing, there is still so much work to do in helping death literacy become part of everyday life. Next slide, please. And so what does low death literacy look like? Right? Low death literacy often shows up in very concrete and painful ways. Families may not know what their loved one wanted. Important decisions may be delayed until a moment of crisis. People may feel overwhelmed by caregiving responsibilities and unsure where to turn for help. Fear and misunderstanding around hospice, palliative care, and dying can make an already difficult time even harder. Grief may also become isolated and private instead of being shared and supported in community. In these moments, death gets reduced to crisis management, paperwork, and uncertainty, rather than being held with dignity and care. Right. And so I use those two images, right? Of obviously the person who is in a medical facility, but also, right, this kind of traditional casket. Um, because I think the funeral industry, right, has also become part of this, um, right? Kind of preying on emotion, preying on people's fears, preying on the fact that, right? Because at the end of the day, the funeral industry is a business as well. And it exists, right, solely to be able to provide people with services, right, that obviously cost money. Um, and there is something, like I said, right, when there is fear and there is uncertainty, there is money to be generated from that. And so, right, it's important to think about how has the lack of death literacy, especially within our own society or within our own culture, created, right, these kind of interconnected systems, right, that all um, kind of generate from the fact that we don't really want to have honest conversations about death. Okay, next question. Next slide, please. And so, what death literacy makes possible? Death literacy opens up new possibilities for how we care for one another. It makes honest conversations more possible. It helps people plan ahead and express their wishes with greater clarity. It can reduce fear and confusion while strengthening caregiving networks and community support. Literacy also helps restore dignity at the end of life by reminding us that good care includes more than medical intervention. It includes presence, accompaniment, meaning making, and the ability to hold one another through grief and transition. Next slide. And so, how do death doulas support, right, death literacy? So this is one of the places where death doulas play an important role. Death doulas help individuals and families talk more openly about dying and provide emotional, spiritual, and practical support through the end of life journey. They can help with advanced care planning conversations, visual presence, legacy work, remembrance, and creating space for reflection and meaning making. In many ways, death doulas help bridge information and care. They support not only the practical realities of dying, but also the human and sacred dimensions of transition. Through this work, they help make death literacy something lived and felt and embodied, not just something understood in theory. Next slide, please. And so death literacy is also ritual literacy, right? And so I also included many images of the various cultures that, like I said, you all will have the opportunity to explore in the upcoming weeks. But death literacy is not only about information, right? Just providing resources is not enough. It is also about ritual, meaning, and relationship. To know how to face death is also to know how to honor it. Rituals help create space for transition, grief, remembrance, blessing, and release. They give shape to what can others feel overwhelming or unspoken. Whether they are spiritual, cultural, family-based, or deeply personal, rituals remind us that death is not only clinical, it is sacred, relational, and communal. In this way, ritual becomes one of the ways we bring death literacy to life. Next slide, please. And so, what would a more death literate world look like? A more death literate world would be one where families could talk openly about end of life wishes before crisis happens. It would be a world where children are included in age appropriate conversations about grief and loss rather than being left alone in silence or confusion. It would be a world where communities know how to support caregiving, where grief is met with presence rather than avoidance, and where rituals of remembrance are seen as essential forms of care. In a more death literate world, death would not be treated as something shameful or hidden, but as a part of life that deserves tenderness, honesty, and communal support. Next slide, please. And to become death literate, is to remember how to honor life. To become death literate is not just simply to know more about dying, it is to become more present to life, more prepared to care, and more willing to honor the sacredness of transition, grief, memory, and love. Death literacy invites us to move beyond silence and fear and instead meet death with honesty, tenderness, and community. When we learn how to speak about death, prepare for it, and ritualize it with care, we also learn how to live more fully with one another. In learning how to honor death, we remember how to honor life. Death literacy is not simply about becoming less emotional around death. It is about becoming more present, more capable, and more humane in how we meet it. It asks us to bring death out of silence and back into relationship, back into care, back into ritual, and back into community. It asks us to, when we become more death literate, we do not only prepare for dying, we also deepen how we accompany the living, honor the dead, and remember what matters most. And so this, next slide, please. And so I think we have a few minutes. I'm not sure if we want to open it up to kind of a reflection or discussion section. But if not, I am open to stop here as well. So thank you all so much for allowing me this opportunity to talk about death literacy with you all.
Wow. Wow. Jerry, that was wonderful. Yeah,
Thank you.
we're open for questions. Where you're kind of finding your mics and unmuting yourselves. Um, this is such a great step off to where we're going with this series and how death ritual really enhances and welcomes death and death is seen as part of life and part of community and we share in it and kind of how we in the Western world and what we've done about death has been totally the opposite, and we're losing that community. Um, so in the next few weeks, we're gonna go around the world, and next week we're gonna visit Latino Hispanic rituals, um, indigenous groups. The following week we'll do Islam, Muslims, and Indonesia, and then we'll move on on our fourth week to Jewish and Buddhist ritual and belief, and visit our Asian neighbors in Japan and the Philippines, Hong Kong, maybe. And, and just kind of think about, how these rituals are helping them and kind of how it normalizes death and makes people less fearful of death as opposed to where we are now. Um, Gillian will finish our series when we talk about our culture and how death is seen in our culture and how the funeral industry has changed, um, and our practices are evolving as we speak. I've seen such a huge change since I started doing hospice. So I will open this up to questions for Jerry. If you don't want to talk, you can also type it in chat. I'll look in the chat. But yeah, a lot of talk about the inclusion of resources for children. Yeah, I have a question out there for people. If you want to chime in, you know, how old were you when you experienced your first death? And how did that go? I mean, how was it explained to you? Any takers on that one? Tara?
So this is interesting. I wasn't I wasn't at all cognizant of what was going on. My paternal grandfather passed away when I was between 2 and 3. And I told my parents about this recurring dream that I'd had as long as I could remember dreams, that I was with mom and dad and I was in between them holding hands, and it was a dark, kind of gloomy day, and my father was very sad, and we were looking at headstones, and they looked at each other because what I was dreaming was actually a memory of when my grandfather died. And they had gone to look for a headstone, and they had taken me and
Ah,
left the 3 older ones home. Um, but it was just such a dark, dreary thing. And I think that stuck with me more than I knew. And as I went through my yoga doula training with Natalie, and we started doing these readings and exploring, it was very freeing, very letting go of a lot of stress. But yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
So you were with your mom and dad looking for headstone, but you didn't know why.
I didn't know what we were doing. Absolutely not. Yeah, just there. And so I guess that is not probably, is definitely my earliest memory, and it's death related.
Mhm.
So
Angela writes, I was 10 and it was my pet. My dad gave me a choice to be in the room when they passed or stay out of the room. I knew I needed to be present. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and your pet appreciated you being there, Angela. Yeah. Christina writes, at 15, my mother, oh, I'm sorry. No one explained. The medical philosophy at the time was not to discuss death and dying with children. During that time, I decided to become a psychologist and make sure this did not stay the norm. Wow. So your mom, Christina, was dying, and you didn't get to participate in that at all.
No, we just went to visit her in the hospital as if she was going to get out. So,
Yeah.
no. Somewhere in myself, I knew, but I didn't know how to put it into words till after the fact.
Yeah. That's sad. Yeah.
This is Cloudy. Oh, oops,
Hi,
sorry.
Cody. No, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to share. I grew up in the country in Austria, and death then was handled very, very natural. So when, let me say, a neighbor or a relative passed on, then the deceased body was kept at home, usually in the bed for 3 days, and neighbors, family, friends, they came. And every evening, the whole community got together and we prayed. So I would think maybe 2, 3, when my parents, like my older siblings, were taken to the neighbors, and we all, gathered around the deceased body. And it was fairly natural for me as a child that there's somebody dead. And I grew up very Catholic, so there was always the spiritual faith background. You go to heaven, you die, you go to heaven. So for me, from early childhood on, death had never anything on it that would have scared me or was mysterious. It was very, very natural because we just, as I mentioned, we grew up and we were just confronted with it from early, early age on.
Wow. And this was in Austria.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah. I was just going to share. I was probably 2 or 3 when my grandpa died. And I remember going into the hospital room, and this was in North Dakota, and he was in an oxygen tent. And but again, as a 3-year-old, I just couldn't understand why they had my grandpa underneath all this plastic. And for you young folks, you probably have never seen an oxygen tent, but back in the day, that's how we delivered oxygen. And we visited with them. My sister played jacks on the floor. And then we left and went back to home, Colorado. He died, and I don't remember ever being told that he had died. I just thought, oh, well, that's where he is now. And so for the longest time, I had like the vision that death and dying and heaven was a hospital room with an oxygen tent. Yeah. Wow. Well, Jerry, thank you tonight. It was fabulous, and it teaches us why what we do at Abode and all of you who have some piece of it, and why it's so important to get death literacy out in our communities, to talk about it and help people prepare for this most important event in our lives. And so next week, we'll be visiting Native American, Indigenous people, Hispanic and Latino cultures and rituals. So same time next week. We'll be on Thursday at 6:30, and I'll see you all then. Thank you all, and have a beautiful evening.